What makes a verbal battle truly exciting? It's not the number of participants or the headlines, it's the moment when one person goes up against the system and wins. You're about to witness that moment today, right now. A battle is underway where truth meets manipulation, and confidence meets ridicule. In the White House press conference room, journalists are already setting their traps. Cameras are trained on a woman who will come to the podium. Her goal is not to make excuses or prevaricate. She knows she is in for an attack, but she has the most important weapons, facts, and the ability to take a punch. Her name is Karoline Leavitt, and in a few minutes she will show how real information warfare is conducted. Be attentive until the very end, because the ending will surprise you. Washington, White House. The tension in the press conference room was palpable. Bright spotlights flooded the room, causing reporters' skin to glisten with barely noticeable beads of sweat. Magazines, clipboards, and tape recorders sat on journalists' laps, ready to record every word. The smell of fresh ink-soaking paper notebooks mingled with the aroma of coffee from the plastic cups many held in their hands. There was a noticeable excitement among the journalists, which was turning into hidden aggression. Today's briefing promised to be hot. The news agency's cameras were already on. The red lights of the recording devices signaled that every movement, every emotion, every gesture would be broadcast. People whispered, looked at each other, assessing each other. Who would be able to ask the most pointed question today? Who would get the editor's applause for a successful provocation? The door at the far end of the room opened, and the room fell silent. Karoline Leavitt walked in. Her confident gait left no doubt that she was not just a press secretary, but a strategist entering the information battlefield. Her formal jacket fit perfectly, emphasizing her business style, and her hair, pulled back into a neat ponytail, gave her image a collected and strict look. She was not in a hurry, but she did not hesitate either. Every movement she made spoke of complete self-confidence. She had not come to justify herself, she had come to tell the truth. Stopping at the podium, she glanced around the room. Her gaze was even, calm, yet penetrating. She saw before her not just people, but an army of professionals, each pursuing their own goals. Some wanted objectivity, but most wanted scandal. She knew that her words would make headlines, that any answer she gave would be taken out of context, that every pause would be seen as weakness, but she was ready. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Her voice sounded clear and measured, forcing everyone to fall completely silent. Let's get to the questions. A moment of silence, then the room came alive. Hands shot up, microphones moved, someone fidgeted, trying to get her attention. But before she could choose, a voice spoke without a raised hand, a voice full of self-confidence and a hint of mockery. A CNN reporter. She recognized him immediately, but she wasn't the only one. Everyone knew him. This man never asked questions, he set traps. And he thought that this time his victim would be Karoline. But he was wrong. Ms. Levitt, he began, leaning back and folding his arms across his chest. His voice was confident, even mocking, his gaze intense and searching. Do you not think that the administration you represent is deliberately restricting the freedom of the press by denying access to those who ask uncomfortable questions? Some of the journalists in the room nodded approvingly, their eyes gleaming with interest. They were waiting for an answer. They were waiting to see how the press secretary would get out of this situation. The question was phrased in such a way that any answer could be used against her. Silence was an admission of guilt, a denial was an attack on the press. But Karoline didn't even blink. Let's get this straight, she said, her voice level but firm. You mean access for the media that has spent years spreading false information about the president and his administration? Some of the journalists exchanged glances. Tension filled the room. The CNN reporter frowned, but continued his attack. You call this false information, but independent sources. Karoline interrupted him with a raised eyebrow. Independent? You mean your own anonymous sources, who have never been able to confirm their words. Sources that refer to each other every time, creating the illusion of truth. Do you really call this journalism? The reporter tried to object, but Karoline didn't give him a chance. She continued, not taking her eyes off the audience. Now everyone was looking only at her. Let's recall recent cases when your articles created a public resonance, but later turned out to be falsifications. How do you explain this? She paused. No one answered. She took a step forward, her voice becoming firmer. You find it more convenient to ask questions than to answer. That's your style, but if the press demands the truth, why doesn't it want to answer for its words? The journalists began to exchange glances. Several looked down. They realized that the opponent they had underestimated was stronger. Some of them looked at her differently. Respect appeared in their eyes. They saw before them not just a press secretary, but a professional. The air in the press conference room grew thicker. The cameras continued to record every second, but now the lenses were focused not on the journalists, but on Karoline Leavitt. She bravely withstood the gazes of those who, just a minute ago, considered her easy prey, but now the situation had changed. They did not attack, but defended themselves. Some of them already understood that this briefing would go down in history. You talk about freedom of the press, she continued, resting her palms on the podium, but what about journalistic responsibility? After all, every false news story, every distorted fact has consequences. Let's face it, if the press demands honesty from politicians, why doesn't it hold itself to the same standards? The CNN journalist, who had been trying to seize the initiative, felt himself losing control. He raised his hand, hoping to bring the conversation back on track. Ms. Levitt, his voice no longer sounded so self-assured, you accuse the press of bias, but don't you think that the government itself is forming a picture of the world that is convenient for itself, by limiting access to information? Karoline smiled, not mockingly, but with a hint of irony. She was now in control of the conversation. Access to information? Interesting, she nodded, taking several sheets of paper from a folder lying on the podium. Then perhaps you can explain why, over the past 3 years, your publication has been publishing articles based on anonymous sources that later turned out to be completely unfounded. For example, this material, she picked up one of the sheets of paper, was published a month ago, and a week later your own editor acknowledged it was a mistake, but, of course, the refutation appeared in small print on page 5, while the headline about another scandal was splashed across all news feeds. The room froze. Someone shifted in their chair. The CNN reporter pressed his lips together, unsure of how to respond. This time he was not on the attack, but on the defensive. Karoline paused to let the room digest the information, then continued. Here's another example. Your colleagues recently claimed that our administration allegedly puts pressure on independent media. However, no evidence of this was provided. Just words, just a convenient narrative. Isn't this manipulation? Isn't this an undermining of trust in the journalistic profession itself? Several people in the room glanced at each other. Some of them disagreed with her words, but they couldn't help but admit that her arguments were ironclad. Karoline wasn't just shooting back, she was showing reality as it is. So here's my question to you. She crossed her arms and leaned forward slightly. If you're truly fighting for the truth, are you willing to admit your mistakes as loudly as you accuse us? Are you willing to apologize for stories that turned out to be false? Are you willing to take the same responsibility that you demand from politicians? The room fell silent. A few cameras were still recording the proceedings, but now even the journalists who had initially supported CNN's aggressive rhetoric were looking at the situation differently. They realized that they were not just at a press conference, they were witnessing something bigger. Someone finally cleared his throat and muttered quietly, "She has a point of view." The others were silent, but their eyes showed one thing: respect. they didn't expect Karoline to be so firm in her stand and also put them in an uncomfortable position. The CNN reporter didn't try to interrupt anymore, he knew he had lost. When the press conference ended, there was a tense silence in the room. The reporters who had come with the intention of exposing Karoline now felt differently. They had expected the standard excuses, the evasive answers, but instead they saw a man who not only took a blow, but also struck back, and not with emotion, but with facts. Some of the journalists discussed her performance for a long time, some tried to seize on individual moments to turn them into scandalous headlines, but even they understood it was a defeat not for Karoline, but for their own strategy. The next day, articles did come out. Some publications tried to denigrate her, others acknowledged her power, but most importantly, viewers drew their own conclusions. The video of the press conference spread across social networks, gaining millions of views, and among the comments, one phrase was heard more and more often. "This woman knows what she's talking about." Karoline left the room feeling not only tired, but also satisfied. She knew she had done more than just fend off an attack today, she had changed the rules of the game. Now journalists have begun to respect her.